Good afternoon and welcome to the second day of the three-part RISE Samvad talks for the PhD colloquium. The first speaker is Anjana Prabhakar, supervised by Professor Tricha Anjali. Her broad area of research is security in wireless multi-hop networks, specifically with respect to IoT devices. Today she'll be presenting her talk titled Does Trust-Based Consensus Boost Blockchain? Welcome, Anjana.
Thank you. Happy to be part of this PhD colloquium.
The second speaker of the day is Arvind Upreti, supervised by Professor V. Sridhar. His broad area of research encompasses the socio-economic effects of automation, specifically on labor markets. Today, he'll be presenting his talk titled Study of Automation and Effect on Employment Through Agent-Based Models. Welcome, Arvind.
Good afternoon and thanks for the opportunity.
The third speaker is Manpreet Kaur Jaswal, supervised by Professor Subir Kumar Roy. Her research interests broadly lie in the area of VLSI design. Today she'll be presenting her talk titled Non-Intrusive Profiler for Dynamic Reconfigurability. Welcome, Manpreet.
Hi all, glad to be here.
So I guess we can get started with our first talk.
A very good afternoon to all of you. So today, as part of IIITB RISE 2020, I would like to share my inputs on the topic, Does Trust-Based Consensus Boost Blockchain? So first, let's begin with what a blockchain is. So in simple words, it's a timestamp series of immutable records of data that is managed by a cluster of computers, not owned by any single entity. So in short, a blockchain can be called as a block of data which cannot be changed by anybody, and it's managed by a group of computers, not owned by a single entity. So now when I say the blockchain is managed by a group of computers, there should be some kind of agreement between the different computers as to which block needs to be added and which computer has to add the block and so on. So this agreement is called as a consensus in blockchain. It's nothing but a general agreement between the different computers. Now let's see what exactly is the role of consensus in a blockchain is. Primarily, it designates a node as a leader for adding the block. So out of the different computers in the cluster of computers, it has to select a particular computer as the leader, and it's a leader node that gets to propose a block. So once a block is proposed, the other nodes can decide whether to accept or reject the block. So once accepted, the block gets added to the blockchain. And then the other nodes have to synchronize and add this particular block to their blockchain as well. So that is, there has to be a consistency among the different copies of the blockchain which each of these computer is having with it. So like I said, each computer proposes a different block, but then it's only the leader's block that gets added finally to the blockchain. And this has been decided by the consensus. So there are different consensus mechanisms currently, like proof of work, proof of stake, delegated proof of stake, and so on. But the problem is they have some inherent drawbacks like high network latency, wastage of computation power, less transaction throughput, quasi-centralized, and so on. Now these drawbacks are due to the reason that the blockchain was initially developed for a financial application, like the Bitcoin, as you know. So what happens? The focus of financial application is 100% security, 100% accuracy, and not network latency or transaction throughput. So now when we have to use a blockchain for a non-financial application, we need a new consensus. So like I said, the earlier consensus schemes had certain drawbacks. So in order to come up with a good consensus scheme for non-financial application, we need to overcome those drawbacks. So the new consensus scheme should support decentralization. It should have less communication overhead. It should have less computation and energy involved, and it should have less latency in transaction confirmation. So in short, financial application where the participants are anonymous, like in the case of Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency, the consensus has to be more robust and secure, and energy and speed are not a criteria. Whereas when it comes to non-financial application, where the participants are known to each other, that is, the whole thing is happening in a more trusted environment, The focus is to maximize the transaction throughput. Now, what do I mean by trust? In short, I would say it's believing that a particular person or a particular process will do what as expected. So when I say node A trusts node B, so what I intend to say is that node A expects that node B would perform certain actions or certain procedures. There has been limited work in this area where the concept of trust has been included in the consensus mechanism of a blockchain, but nevertheless, none of them were able to quantify this trust. So there's a void in the literature, and we are trying to propose a trust-dependent consensus which incorporates trust into the consensus of a blockchain. So we have developed this TCON, or the trust-dependent consensus, for a blockchain-based IoT access control system. But however, it can be extended for other applications as well. So this is the OTAC, or the access control, that I was mentioning in the previous slide in short. So as you can see, it has 3 different layers. The bottommost being the IoT network layer. You can see different IoT networks there, like the smart home, smart healthcare, smart transport, and so on. And each network is headed by its manager. These managers send the transaction. Transactions are nothing but communication between 2 entities. It could be within the network, like say within the smart home, or it could be inter-network, that is from smart home to smart healthcare, or smart healthcare to smart transport, and so on. So these transactions are sent by the respective managers to the layer above, which is the relay network. It is this relay network that holds a blockchain that I was explaining earlier. And these are the cluster heads, the computers that you can see over here. They're the cluster heads. And these are the cluster of computers that I was talking about earlier. So it is these cluster heads that's responsible for the consensus, or it is these cluster heads that take part in the consensus of the blockchain. So now in other consensus scheme, what happens is, as soon as the transactions reaches a particular cluster head, they put these transactions into a block, and the leader node, again selected by the consensus scheme, proposes the block, and the other nodes have to agree or disagree to that block, accept or reject the block. So as soon as the block is formed, the cluster head, the leader cluster head, has to validate all the transactions in the block. So suppose there are 1,000 transactions in a block, it has to validate all the 1,000 transactions in that particular block. And once it is fine with it, it proposes that block, and this block is forwarded to all other cluster heads in the network. And the non-leader cluster heads, they again check these 1,000 transactions, again validate them, and if found satisfactory, they accept that particular block. Now what we propose is that, suppose this relay network is happening in a trusted environment. That is, suppose the cluster heads trust each other based on some trust metric, which it could be, the trust could be quantified in different ways. So we'll see how we have done it. So suppose each cluster heads trust each other. So in that case, instead of checking all the 1,000 transactions, the leader node can check some X percentage of the transactions, and then this block can be validated by, say, Y percentage of the cluster heads. Instead of 100% of the transactions being verified and 100% of the validators validating the block, we are proposing that X percentage of the transactions can be validated by Y percentage of the cluster heads. So by bringing down the number of transactions to be validated and the number of validators in the network, we can reduce the communication and computation complexity. So that is our TCON, or the trust-based consensus, in a nutshell. So the key features are like maintaining a list of trusted cluster heads. Not all C heads or the cluster heads validate the block, and the trust metric is mathematically formulated. That's the mathematical formula, like how you decide whether to trust or not trust a particular cluster head. So that is what is represented in the table over here. As you can see, it has 2 parameters. First is the number of blocks verified, And the second, as you can see, it's class 1, class 2, class 3. It's nothing but the level of security that is required for each transaction. So more the security the transaction requires, those transactions would be put under class 1. So if least security is required, then those transactions are put under class 3. So depending on the level of security required and depending on the number of blocks that have already been included in the blockchain, the number of transactions that needs to be verified changes. So more the number of blocks that have been verified, lesser the number of transactions that needs to be verified. Because what we assume is as more and more blocks get added to the blockchain, your trust value increases. And so less number of transactions need to be verified. So every time there is a malicious action that's happening, your score reduces. So accordingly, the table's value would be changing. So another parameter that we define is called the trust rating, TR, which is a combination of direct trust and indirect trust. Direct trust is the first component and indirect trust is the second component. So direct trust is something like saying, I trust my friend, which is a direct relationship. And indirect trust would be something like, I trust my friend's friend. So that is a dependent trust. So I trust my friend, so I trust his or her friend. So a combination of that will give you the trust rating for each cluster head. So then again, you can decide what is the number of transactions that needs to be verified by the non-leader nodes. So the number of transactions depends again here on the trust rating as well as the level of security required. It's the same notation that we use in class 1, class 2 and class 3. And now once the leader node proposes a block, we need to find out how many C heads have to, or the cluster heads have to validate that block, or what is that value of Y, or how many number of cluster heads that has to verify that particular block. So that is represented in the second table over here. So here again, as the number of blocks increases, number of blocks that has been added to the blockchain increases, the number of votes that you need to add the new block decreases. Now into the security analysis. Checking a fraction of the total transactions is not a threat capable of serious harm, as there are multiple validators for the same block and each validator would be choosing a different set of transactions to validate. Let's see how that's happening. Now, suppose this is the cluster network that we're talking of. So where each person represents the cluster head and they are given the same block with the same list of transactions to validate. And we're currently considering a scenario where there are 4 such cluster heads and they're given the same set of transactions. So the notation used here is question mark for a transaction that is not validated, and a green tick and a red cross for the usual meaning, a valid transaction or an invalid transaction. So as you can see, each cluster head is selecting a different set of transactions to verify. And nevertheless, it's the 3 cluster heads are coming up with the result that the second transaction is invalid. So even though the second cluster head over here is not validating the second transaction, even then the others are coming up saying that the second transaction is invalid. So as a result, this block will not eventually get into the blockchain. So what we're trying to say is that it's not required that every validator or every cluster head check all the transactions that's there in the block. So the probability that all validators will choose the same set of transactions is highly unlikely. So this again can be mathematically proved. So I have not included those results over here since it's waiting publication. Now into the performance analysis. As you can guess, since it's only a fraction of transactions that's being validated and it's only a fraction of the cluster heads that's going to validate this particular block, the performance actually improves when compared to the other consensus scheme. The TCON restricts low trust valued C heads from being in the TCL or the trusted cluster list, and thus save their energy from being spent unnecessarily. So if some C heads have a low trust value, you don't send those transactions to those particular cluster heads, and so there is no chance of a malicious action, or there is no chance of your block being dropped and so on. To conclude, TCON established the feasibility of using trust in the relay network of blockchain-based non-financial applications to reach consensus. The trust metric developed is one of its kind, and efforts will be taken in future to quantify the notion of trust in different ways as possible. So with that, we come to the end of my talk. So I would like to thank the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, Government of India, for funding this research. And the basis of this talk is from the publication TCON, a lightweight trust-dependent consensus framework for blockchain, which is published in 2019 Comson Conference. These are the other references. Thank you. So any questions, you can either post it in the chat box, or maybe we can take it together in the end of the session.
Thanks, Anjana.
Sure.
Next, Arvind, can you please share your screen?
The title of my talk would be Study of Automation and Effect of Automation on Employment, and looking it through some models created using agent-based modeling techniques. So to give to introduce this particular work, looking at the contemporary literature on automation, particularly the AI index reports, they observe constant improvement found in automation technologies across the technical areas such as computer vision, natural language processing, and tasks which require reasoning over multiple data types. Now, these technological advancements focus on tasks which are not just routine, but also non-routine. And in this case, what I mean by routine tasks is tasks for which the knowledge is well-defined, the series of steps are well-defined, whereas the non-routine tasks are the tasks which require more of a tacit kind of knowledge. Now, these tasks have been studied and found to be pervasive across different types of occupations in different sectors. One of the study observes that 60% of all occupations have at least 30% technically automatable activities. And also certain studies have looked at the prospects of automation, looking at not just the technical feasibility aspect, but the aspects of the deployment costs and the complexity of actually deploying such technology and its social acceptability. Automation has also been looked at from specifically on its effect on the labor market, where the literature has studied the effects of automation and the kind of forces it applies on the labor market, with special mention of two kinds of forces. One is the displacement effect, wherein the factors of production, specifically people who are performing the task, are displaced by machines, and also a productivity effect wherein demand of certain factors of production increases because of high productivity of the automated tasks. Now, the implication of automation on the labor market can be studied if you look at the type of tasks in which machines have developed their comparative advantage over workers, and also studying these tasks, these occupations at the granularity of individual tasks, and specifically in context of the sector and the specific occupation wherein the automation is playing a role. So in this study, we have tried to study the research question of studying the effect of automation of routine tasks, which we also call as low skill automation, and non-routine tasks, on the wage disparity between low skill and high skill workers which are associated with these tasks. So there have been some studies that have been undertaken in context of the recent technological advancements in automation in economics literature, wherein automation has been studied at the level of tasks, and different kinds of factors of production are in a framework are supposed to compete for each individual tasks based on the productivity they have to perform those tasks. So in such a model, basically the equilibrium conditions are found as to see what will be the demand of different kind of factors of production and what will be the resulting effect on the factor prices, which in case of human labor results into the wages that different kind of workers can achieve in different kind of automation scenarios. In addition, such kind of study has also been based on the kind of decisions that firm make as to how much quantity to produce at which the profits are maximized, specifically to the levels at which the marginal costs equal the price of 1 unit of goods or service that a firm produces, and also the firm's decision as to whether to use labor or capital in case the task is automatable, seeing the relative productivity of each of these factors of production. To carry on with our study, we used the agent-based model methodology in which we create an artificial world of heterogeneous agents and model the interaction between these agents to see the emergent patterns of happening over a period of time based on these interactions. The advantages of using agent-based model to study this particular problem lies in the ability of ABMs to model adaptive agents, which are not necessarily rational in their approach. And also it gives the ability to provide a more natural description of the entities involved in terms of certain rules. And also ABMs help to understand the emergent phenomena from a bottoms-up approach. So to give an overview of our modeling landscape, we have considered broadly the agents as depicted in this figure, where in the middle we have the firm, which is trying to produce a unit of goods or service. And for doing so, it has to perform a series of tasks which can be segregated as routine as well as non-routine tasks. And a subset of these individual tasks set, there are certain tasks which can be technically automated and certain tasks which cannot be technically automated. And to perform these, there is a specific kind of productivity associated against each of these tasks for each of the factors of production. And the firm tries to deploy these factors of production, which can be different kinds of workers based on different kind of skills that they possess, and also machines which can as well perform some of these tasks. The firm tries to deploy it in a manner that is most profitable to it. To get a little bit specific on these agents, certain key characteristics or properties of the firm agent are the set of tasks that it sort of defines and performs to be able to produce its goods or service, and the kind of decisions it makes in terms of which are technically automatable tasks and which are not. So there are subsets of such tasks which are technically automatable or non-automatable, both in the routine and non-routine tasks subset. Similarly, we can define the worker agents and introduce heterogeneity in these worker agents based on the productivity, the differential productivity they possess in performing these different kind of tasks, which is represented over here. And based on these productivities might be different based on the different types of workers, their skills, their education. But this gives the ability to the firm to see which of these workers to actually deploy to be most productive to produce a unit of output. So to give an overview of the behavior of different kind of agents, this particular slide attempts to, at a high granularity, tell what is the behavior of firm agents and the in terms of choosing the factors of production. So the firm has to perform each task in the task spectrum, both from routine and non-routine subset. And for doing that, it has to make a decision as to which of the factors of production to choose, which would be most profitable to produce that particular task, and subsequently to combine output of each of these individual tasks to produce the final goods or service, and subsequently decide what should be the optimum level of output that this firm should produce so as to maximize its profit. And in doing so, the different kind of factors of production associate themselves with the firm, and which in turn sort of translates into the demand for each of these factors of production, and that in turn sort of determines their factor prices, which might be wage rate in terms of workers and rental rate in terms of in case of machines. So in this particular study, as a preliminary exercise, we conducted few experiments to see how the extent of automation affects these different factors of production, and the demand of these different factors of production, and in turn what is its effect on the wages that the workers receive based on the skills that they possess, and whether it introduces any kind of wage inequality, which basically means that certain type of workers receive a lower wage as compared to other type of workers. So in this particular case, we studied the automation of routine tasks, that is the subset of tasks in a firm which are routine in the sense that they are kind of well-defined set of tasks. And in this model, we have assumed that the low-skill workers associate themselves with these kind of routine tasks, wherein the high-skill workers are associated with the non-routine subset of tasks. So in this particular case, we studied how, as we progressively make the routine tasks technically automatable, how does it actually translate into the demand of different kinds of these factors of production. So as depicted in this figure, we have on the x-axis, we have the percentage of routine tasks that are automated, whereas on the y-axis, we have the demand of workers employed by firms. So we look at so we see that as we increase the automation of routine tasks, progressively the demand of low-skill workers fall, as is expected, and they get compressed into a very narrow subset of routine tasks, wherein there is a higher level of competition between these low-skill workers, thereby leading to a depression of their wages, as depicted in the second figure. In contrast, if we look at what is the effect of automation of routine tasks on high-skilled workers, we see that the demand of high-skilled workers progressively increases as the extent of automation increases, primarily because of the productivity effect that plays its role, wherein because of the automation of routine tasks, there is a high demand for the workers that are deployed in non-routine tasks. So therefore, in the figure 1, we see an upward sloping curve depicting higher demand for the high-skilled workers. Similarly, because of the higher demand on the figure 2, we also see an increase in the wages that are commanded by workers belonging to the high skill category set of workers. And the dark sort of curve in this figure 2 depicts the wage inequality that we observe as we progressively automate more and more tasks, wherein which sort of points out that there's a greater competition for low skill workers because they are getting compressed into a narrower and narrower subset of routine tasks, whereas the demand for high skilled worker increases because of their work becomes more valuable in terms of the productivity. And also uh, the reason also hinges on the ability of the low skilled workers to actually upskill themselves and move on to the non-routine task subset where they can sort of take up and compete against the high skilled workers. So if that ability is there, and that is an experiment I've not shown in this particular presentation, but that is another offshoot of this case 1. In case 2, we look at the other aspect of automation where we look at the non-routine task and try to see what is the effect of progressive automation of non-routine tasks on the demand of high skill and low skill workers, and subsequently what is its effect on the wages and the wage inequality. So as we see again in contrast to the case 1, in this particular case we see the high skilled workers get compressed and concentrated in a narrower subset of non-routine tasks, whereas the low skilled workers activities and work becomes more in demand. Therefore it translates into the higher demand and the higher sloping, the upward sloping curve as observed in figure 1. And in figure 2 we see its corresponding effect on their wages, their factor prices, wherein we have assumed in this model that the high skilled workers have a wage premium, as in their wages are higher than low skilled workers. But when we simulate this case 2, we see a drop in this wage premium in terms of drop in the wage inequality, whereas the demand of high skilled workers reduces and the demand of low skilled worker increases. The wage inequality tends to drop over the period where the percentage of non-routine task automation increases progressively. So these are some of the results that we have tried to simulate through an agent-based model, which has the results of which we have tried to compare with the other theoretical and empirical models that are available. In terms of the behavior, these models concur with these 2 specific cases that we have discussed in the earlier slides. There are certain offshoots of these 2 cases in which we introduce more complexity and heterogeneity amongst the workers and the type of decisions that firms make, but that will not be a part of my talk today.
Thanks, Arvind. Manpreet, would you like to share your screen?
Yes, I'm sharing my screen. Hello all. Myself, Manpreet Kaur Jaswal. Thanks you for joining in for my presentation at RISE Samvad Talk series. In this presentation, I'll be sharing details about my research work titled DynRP, which is a non-intrusive profiler built by us to aid dynamic reconfigurability. This work is supervised by Professor Subir Kumar Roy from IIIT Bangalore. Now there are 4 different terms in a single headline: non-intrusive, profiling, reconfigurability, and dynamic reconfigurability. Let's dive deep one by one and understand the context. The applications our technology can serve are evolving very fast, and design goals are becoming more complex than ever before. The research in emerging technological areas such as machine learning, bioinformatics, autonomous robots, computer vision, AI, etc. are taking impactful leaps. But as a hardware design engineer, how do we actually view this transition? From engineering point of view, there are a certain set of challenges that need to be addressed for the same, such as design complexity, which is anyhow increasing, handling huge data in real time, and also there are some runtime specific design goals to be met in runtime based on the application. What motivates us is that in the upcoming decade, what are the possible way outs? We will share a part of some directions the research and hardware platforms is taking in this presentation. Definitely, we need a systematic approach with right set of tools, good heterogeneous accelerator platforms, which have been evolving alongside as a support. Literature also shares a term called dynamic reconfiguration, which in such platforms can help in runtime optimization for meeting the design goals. When I talk about heterogeneous acceleration, what does that mean? This is a simple example to understand the implementation in software versus hardware from one of our references. A Mac unit, which includes repeated occurrence of multiply and accumulate in a loop, take thousands of clock cycle for execution based on the processor. But whereas a hardware designed specifically for that purpose will speed up the processing by a great extent. When we talk about hardware, reconfiguration, heterogeneous platforms, as a researcher in VLSI, FPGAs and MPSOCs come first to my mind. Field programmable gate arrays are based around a matrix of configurable logic blocks connected via programmable interconnects. FPGAs can be reprogrammed to the desired application or functionality requirements even after manufacturing. These enable rapid prototyping, smaller turnaround times to realize any application. Modern FPGAs also contain both processor and programmable logic on a single chip. For example, you can see the yellow portion is for the programmable logic and the green one denotes the processing logic inside. Also, there could be availability of soft processors in the programmable logic of the FPGA fabric as well. All these making them good candidates for heterogeneous implementation. So when I talk about application level to hardware level, profiling tools play a major role in deciding what goes for software synthesis flow and what goes for hardware synthesis flow for the final implementation. The sum of resources required for efficient execution of such applications could be much more than the resources that are available in the physical hardware for execution. So what if we could have a virtual hardware? Like, it sounds like a great idea to have one, but is it possible? Dynamic reconfiguration or dynamic partial reconfiguration is based upon the concept of virtual hardware, which is similar to virtual memory. It allows more sections of an application to be mapped into the hardware in a dynamic context than can be fitted in a non-runtime reconfigurable system. The static reconfiguration flow we usually do in lab for programming FPGA has its own timing overhead, making it inefficient to be done in a runtime context. The figure in your right shows a dynamic reconfiguration flow in a non-commercial warp processor. Here the application code first executes in the processor. The profiler is attached to it so as to determine the critical regions during the execution. The critical regions are then partitioned into hardware using on-chip CAD module, and the the program configurable logic binary is implemented in the FPGA, and the rest of the software binaries are updated for further execution. Everything happening in a dynamic context. So when I talk about dynamic context and everything, like what does that actually mean? What do I mean by saying that? So I have tried to depict an execution flow in a sample C code with the help of this diagram. So to explain the color coding, the process starts from main. The F and L denote the functions and loops inside them. The blue dots represent the path nodes or processes. The orange dot denote the condition-based path branching. The green circles represent that these are loops and they have the further processes inside them. So here the execution starts from the main and enters F1 function, which is called, and after it the function F1 completes, it exits. Post that, loop 1 is called. Now it has two branches, F2 and N2 inside it. Let's say based on the dynamic conditioning, it's L2 which is called. So the path forms like F1, L1, L2. Suppose that it's F2 which is called. So path forms like F1, L1 and F2. And then the loop exits and moves on accordingly and the path is completed there. So based on real-time data, there will be different possibilities of paths of execution like this based on the real-time inputs that we are getting. For example, these three paths are shown what is happening in real time. Now let's say as per static analysis, it was L5 which was supposed to be contributing most to the computation time, hence should be put in hardware for speed up. But in dynamic context, L5 is rarely called. It's actually F4 which is being called again and again and is contributing more to the computation count. Hence actually requires speed up instead of L5. Does this one thought leave us with the room that better optimization can be done considering the dynamic context into account? Also, if some process is put in hardware, it has to go back to its parent, which is another overhead. And in case the parents, it's not in its vicinity. And this applies to the entire parent hierarchy. For example, F1 should go back to L4, which should go back to L3 and so on. Whatever the parent hierarchy of that particular code is. So how do we find the dynamic parent-child relationship in real time? And how much portion of the path needs to be kept together? So in a dynamic context, if it can be found out which processes are currently active or could become active based on the past execution history or share a common path, such processes can be dynamically reconfigured to be kept in the vicinity of each other. Dynamic reconfiguration in heterogeneous platforms as per literature can hence serve various applications like dynamic optimization of design goals, fulfilling space requirements, realizing adaptive hardware algorithms, and swapping configurations in and out of actual hardware as and when deemed necessary. So here's a list of profiler requirements and parameters that we have discussed, which are required for aiding the dynamic reconfigurability. The last one being memory, which are limited and costlier. Hence, we need to have a mechanism to use the storage profiler memory very efficiently. In this slide, let's try to link different pieces of literature till the year 2020 as well to complete the picture. The software and OS side is very important as well because CPU and hardware are exchanging configuration data in runtime. Mechanisms for facilitation must be in place. Next comes the hardware architecture side. Can dynamic reconfiguration be even supported by the underlying architecture? And then the technology support. What all can be possibly done for reducing the FPGA reconfiguration time? Dynamic analysis. It's about the status of execution and runtime. Trace data analysis has found applicability in runtime verification, debugging, and now as well as profiling, which is nothing but you monitor the execution of your application in runtime in order to aid its optimization. There are different kinds of profiling tools broadly categorized. The software and hardware base will force you to modify your application code or the processor implementation in order to enable profiling. Whereas the concept of FPGA-based profiling is that you augment the profiler with the real-time output traces of the soft processor and do not intrude in the actual executing block. So by the end of this slide, I have explained all the terminologies in my PPT title, which is non-intrusive profiling, reconfiguration, what is a dynamic context, and what is dynamic reconfiguration. And this makes us list our profiler, which is DynRP, in the list of existing profilers for comparison and usage. We have compared our work with Snoopy and Kumar for the scope of this paper. Snoopy is in, these are the two architectures which I'll be going one by one in short. Snoopy is an FPGA based non-intrusive hardware application profiler, which requires prior information regarding address bounds of the regions whose cycle counts must be profiled, which is okay for non-nested processes. For example, if you want to account for L1, you should know the bounds of the L1 and then map it to a segment counter, and it will count the execution counts taken by it in runtime. But when we map a segment counter to F1, it will not differentiate if it has other child processes inside it and attribute the entire execution to the parent process. If one needs to profile a nested process, the bounds and the segment counter need to be allocated separately to each. Also, you can see the F1 is called 3 times intermediately. So it won't attribute these separate counts to function separately. If you want to know what is the actual execution count of F1 without L1 and F2, you need to map 3 segment counters to a single function. And every segment counter contains a comparator unit and the counter unit. Hence, the hardware complexity and area overhead are directly proportional to the regions to be profiled. It is indeed one of the most accurate approach for static analysis based on execution cycle count, as it avoids the latency overheads that can naturally occur in any automated process detection, identification, and tracking. This kind of latency overheads are implicit on our approach and the one described by Kumar as well. The approach taken by Kumar implements 2 profilers separately, one for function and one for loop. The objective is to track non-intrusively the occurrence of either of them by decoding the real-time trace data from the soft processor which is available in the FPGA fabric. It uses a single counter unlike Snoopy, as we won't know a priori the number of processes because it wants to detect them automatically in runtime based on the dynamic execution context. But a single counter implementation will require extra clock cycles to forward the accumulated counts to the count storage and reset the counter once the counter is stopped or it detects the completion of a process execution. This results in improper counting, especially in case of nested functions and loops. DynRP overcomes this drawback by a dual counter implementation operating in synchronization with the automated tracking unit, which will be shown ahead. Hence, we propose DynRP, which is capable of non-intrusively detecting individually all the processes which are executing in a processing unit, their computation cost in the processor, their invocation count, the parent-child modules that lie in the execution part, what is their relationship, as well as a novel scheme for dynamic averaging using basic digital blocks for efficient use of profiler memory. This is the DynRP architecture, which shows the profiler interface with the microprocessor. The instruction decoder and takes non-intrusively the trace signals which is required from the microprocessor. The control module's purpose is to orchestrate between all the profiler modules to facilitate the synchronization. After decoding the process occurrences, they are forwarded to the content addressable memory or the CAM. The job is to create the unique ID, which is then forwarded for automated tracking. The dual counter module makes sure that it is counting for the process currently in execution and switches as soon as the process is found to switch or exit. The memories are synchronized to store the process invocation count, the total cycle count, and the iteration count. We also demonstrate a novel hardware for dynamic averaging as shown by ACCM, which is average cycle count module, and a split RAM to show the corresponding counts. It is implemented as told using simple logic blocks, which consist of multiplexers, shifters, flip-flops, and binary adders, unlike any complex fixed or floating point arithmetic unit already in existence. Averaging is dynamic in the sense it does not wait for the process execution to end to be able to start count averaging, which can be expensive on memory. In the end of this presentation, this table shares the experimenter profiling results for the application benchmark codes with a variety of processes, which is loops and functions with different calling hierarchies in them. It is shown by the initial columns. These include loops with dynamic iteration bounds, processes with variable execution counts during their different invocations and during their different iterations within an invocation, and also child processes which are called from different parent processes. I'll give you a sneak peek into the results respecting the time bound. The columns in red show comparison between DynRP function plus loop profiler, which is a final version, and between the counts reconstructed for averaging from the averaging block for our analysis purpose. It can be seen that both exactly follow the same trend, even though values differ marginally in some rows. The difference between the actual count and the reconstructed count is attributable to the proposed averaging computation technique which we have, but that's okay because we are more interested in the trends of computation count. With the average count being just 25 for CRC-L2, having one of the highest in our table, which is 54,000, it shows the amount of compactness that can be achieved using dynamic averaging. Like you just need to store 25 in a dynamic context. You don't need to store 54,000, which can be expensive on memory. It also brings the actual cost of BLIT F1, which is just 256 instead of the net cost being 98,000. As one can see, it's actually the listed processes L1 and L2 which are contributing to the highest count of 98,000 for the function F1 and not the function itself. So our final DynRP version gives a high granularity into the real-time execution. The profiling of the invocation counts obtained through DynRP is also compared with those obtained by the profiler implementation of Kumar, as Snoopy doesn't have that provision, although it only profiles for function invocation, which come out to be same. But how can we compare the loop invocation and iteration counts then? They can still be analyzed to be correct using the existing data. L1, CRC-L1, which is iterating 256 times, is a parent to child process F2, which is hence invoked 256 times, which can be compared by Kumar's implementation also. Now, F2 is a parent to L2, which is again invoked 256 times, hence verifying the entire count relation. However, this doesn't seem to be true in case of BLIT F1, which is invoked twice. Then why are the child processes L1 and L2 being invoked only once? This is because L1 and L2 are invoked conditionally. So only one invocation in two invocations of F1. This kind of behavior is easily captured by DynRP, unlike Snoopy and Kumar. The count trends in AES also follow a similar explanation with some peculiarity specific to it. To summarize, we have proposed an architecture with results for non-intrusive profiling mechanisms, which can target both loops and functions simultaneously without overlap. We have also given an approach for a novel approach for dynamic count averaging with least overhead. We give a great count information and accurate count attribution. It is considerate of the hierarchy of the dynamic parent-child hierarchy that occurs at runtime. The kind of greater granularity given by DynRP profiling mechanisms pave hence a good way ahead to enable true dynamic reconfiguration. To the best of our knowledge, none of the existing non-intrusive hardware profilers reported in the literature has this capability. So this work recently got accepted as a full paper in IEEE 24th International Symposium on VLSI Design and Test, and it was presented recently in July 2020. We also won Best Paper Award for the same. We sincerely acknowledge Vishweshwarya PhD scheme for electronics and IT under Digital India Corporation, which was formerly Media Lab Asia, under the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. So these are some of the references I referred for making these slides. Thank you very much for bearing with me till the end, and we are open for discussions. Thank you.
Thanks, Manpreet. And thanks to all the speakers for presenting their work. We can move on to the question answer session. So I think Professor Sridhar has mentioned that for Arvind that it would be good if you can highlight the outcome of your research and policies on hiring or firing of workers, minimum wages for certain types of workers, whether the firms should automate or not, given its effect on the labor market. So Arvind, would you like to elaborate on that?
Sure, thank you. As I sort of briefly mentioned the outline of the model and some of the preliminary results, but certain other ways in which this model helps is to look at, say, for example, whether there should be some minimum wages set for different kind of workers, which would lead to better social outcomes for the system as a whole. It might not be the point at which the firm maximizes its profit, but it definitely might result in sort of maximizing the number of workers who are employed in that particular labor market. The other ways in which this model helps is to see the degree of automation. So when I say the degree of automation, it is the percentage of tasks out of the set of automatable tasks that sort of should be automated to achieve an optimum outcome, not just for the firm, but for the society as a whole. So even if the firm, for example, all the tasks that are there for which technology is available, but that might not be the point at which the best outcomes for the workers are observed. So actually take decisions as to suggest what tasks should be automated or what should be the extent of automation, the benefits of upskilling, wherein the workers who are sort of deployed for performing routine tasks, what are the benefits if such subset? So what is its effect on the labor market outcomes in terms of number of people employed or the kind of wages that they receive? So to an extent, I've tried to comment on this question. If there are any further questions related to this, I can further elaborate.
It's perfect.
So I have one for Manpreet. So I'm wondering to what extent you can extend what kind of dynamic elements in a computing system can you accommodate? For example, let us say page faults and in a dynamic memory system, and let us say scheduling on different cores in a multi-core system. So to what extent all of these can be accommodated in your work?
Thank you for the question, sir. So right now we are looking into like if something is offloaded into hardware. So right now the profiler has been implemented to take care if something is entirely executing in the processor and it's not being sent outside for an acceleration or some other core. So how to profile that with a good granularity. And now this work is in progress to extend it to when something is being offloaded to hardware accelerator or to send to multi-core. What all things can we do to implement that real-time profiling? The page faults and now and all we have not thought as of now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so if there are no more questions, I think let's all thank the speakers once again, also for keeping up to the time limits and a really wonderful set of research topics from all of the researchers. So this time we could not have a conventional RISE event, but the Samvad RISE seems to be more popular, so we might be changing the entire structure of RISE as well in the coming days. So thanks everyone, and next week we have 3 more talks from the PhD colloquium from under the same banner of Samvad RISE. So thank you and see you all next week.